Welcome back to XRP on Moon, the channel where we break down the biggest XRP narratives, the hidden signals, and the truths most people are too early or too late to see. Today's topic might challenge everything you think you know about XRP, because what if the majority is completely wrong? What if the assumptions driving the market, the influencers, and even the loudest XRP supporters are missing the bigger picture? Stay with me, because this perspective could completely reshape how you look at XRP moving forward. Right now, the XRP community is one of the most passionate and confident groups in the entire crypto space. You'll hear bold predictions everywhere. Price targets like $10, $100, even $10,000 per XRP. You'll hear narratives about global banking adoption, about XRP replacing SWIFT, about instant settlement becoming the backbone of the financial system. And while some of these ideas are rooted in real developments, the question we need to ask is simple. Are people overestimating the speed, the scale, or even the direction of what's actually happening? Let's step back and look at reality, not hype. XRP is deeply tied to Ripple's vision of cross-border payments. The technology is fast, efficient, and scalable. No doubt about that. But global finance is not just about technology. It's about regulation, trust, infrastructure, and politics. Financial systems don't change overnight, and even when a better solution exists, adoption takes years, sometimes decades. So if the majority of people are expecting an explosive, overnight transformation, that expectation itself might be flawed. Another angle that most people ignore is market psychology. When too many participants believe in the same outcome, markets often move in the opposite direction, at least in the short to medium term. This is not because XRP is weak, but because markets thrive on imbalance. If everyone is positioned for a massive XRP breakout, then who is left to buy at higher prices? This creates a situation where expectations get priced in early and reality struggles to catch up. Now consider this. What if XRP's true value is not in sudden price explosions, but in slow, steady integration into financial systems? That kind of growth doesn't create viral headlines, but it builds something far more powerful: long-term sustainability. The majority might be looking for a quick moonshot, but the real opportunity could lie in patience and understanding, the gradual shift happening behind the scenes. There's also a critical misconception around utility and price. Many believe that if XRP is used globally, its price must skyrocket. But utility does not always translate directly into price appreciation, especially in the short term. Factors like liquidity, supply dynamics, and institutional control play a massive role. What if XRP becomes widely used, but its price moves in a controlled, strategic way rather than a chaotic surge? That would contradict the expectations of many retail investors who are waiting for life-changing gains overnight. Let's not ignore regulation either. XRP has already faced one of the most significant legal battles in crypto history. While progress has been made, the global regulatory landscape is still evolving. Different countries have different approaches, and this fragmentation slows down adoption. If the majority assumes that regulatory clarity means instant global usage, they might be oversimplifying a very complex process. And here's where things get even more interesting. What if the biggest opportunity in XRP comes from something the majority isn't even paying attention to yet? Markets often reward those who see what others don't. While everyone is focused on price predictions and hype cycles, the real shifts might be happening quietly. Partnerships, infrastructure development, and institutional positioning that doesn't make daily headlines. So the real question isn't whether XRP will succeed or fail. The real question is whether the current narrative matches reality. Because if everyone is wrong, whether overly bullish or overly skeptical, then the biggest opportunity lies in identifying that gap. And right now, that gap might be wider than most people realize. Think about it carefully. Are you following the crowd, or are you actually analyzing what's happening beneath the surface? The next thing we need to confront is how narratives are actually formed in the crypto space, and more importantly, who controls them. Because when you look at XRP, you're not just looking at a digital asset, you're looking at one of the most debated, misunderstood, and strategically positioned projects in the entire market. And that creates a very unusual situation where both the strongest supporters and the harshest critics might be operating on incomplete information. In crypto, perception often moves faster than reality. A single headline, a viral tweet, or a YouTube thumbnail can shift sentiment instantly. With XRP, this effect is amplified. When positive news comes out, partnerships, legal updates, or institutional mentions, it spreads like wildfire. But at the same time, negative narratives have also shaped XRP's journey, from regulatory fears to accusations about centralization. The truth is, most participants don't dig deep enough to separate signal from noise. They react, they follow momentum, and they align themselves with whichever narrative feels strongest at the moment. Now, here's the critical part. What if both sides are missing something? What if XRP is neither the instant global takeover asset nor the flawed, limited token that critics claim it is? This middle ground is rarely discussed because it's not as exciting. It doesn't generate clicks, it doesn't trigger emotional reactions, and it doesn't fit neatly into a bullish or bearish storyline. But in markets, the uncomfortable middle is often where the truth lives. Let's talk about institutions, because this is where expectations become even more distorted. A lot of XRP holders believe that banks and financial institutions are just waiting for the green light to fully adopt XRP at scale. But institutions don't operate on hype, they operate on risk management. Even if XRP is technically superior for cross-border payments, adoption depends on compliance, integration costs, internal systems, and geopolitical considerations. These are slow-moving factors, and they don't align with the fast-paced expectations of retail investors. There's also an assumption that once institutions step in, price will automatically explode. But institutional involvement can actually stabilize price rather than accelerate it wildly. Large players prefer predictable environments. They don't want extreme volatility, they want efficiency and control. So if XRP's future involves heavy institutional usage, it could behave very differently from what the majority expects. Instead of sudden spikes, we could see structured growth, liquidity corridors, and controlled expansion. Another layer that most people overlook is liquidity itself. XRP was designed to provide liquidity in cross-border transactions, but that doesn't mean scarcity will instantly drive price upward. In fact, higher liquidity can sometimes reduce volatility. If XRP becomes widely used as a bridge currency, it might circulate more efficiently rather than being locked away as a speculative asset. This challenges the popular belief that everyone holding XRP will simply wait for massive price increases. And then there's the role of time. Timing is one of the most underestimated variables in crypto investing. Even if the long-term vision for XRP plays out, the path to that future might take much longer than people anticipate. Markets don't reward impatience, and they often punish crowded expectations. If the majority is positioned for a short-term breakout, the market may delay that outcome simply because too many people are expecting it. Now think about this from a different angle. What if the real edge is not predicting the exact price of XRP, but understanding the phases it will go through? Early speculation, regulatory battles, gradual institutional testing, infrastructure development, and then, only then, broader adoption. If we are still in the middle phases, then expecting end-stage results right now could be a major miscalculation. This brings us back to the central idea. What if everyone's wrong about XRP? Not because XRP lacks potential, but because the expectations surrounding it are misaligned with reality. The crowd tends to compress timelines, exaggerate outcomes, and ignore complexities. And when that happens, it creates opportunities for those who are willing to think differently, because this is where things start to separate surface-level understanding from real strategic insight. If everyone is focused on price, hype cycles, and short-term expectations, then very few people are actually analyzing XRP from a structural and macro perspective. And that's exactly where the biggest misunderstanding might exist. At its core, XRP is not just a speculative asset. It was designed with a very specific role in mind: liquidity movement across borders. That's a completely different purpose compared to many other cryptocurrencies that rely heavily on narratives like decentralization, maximalism, or store of value positioning. XRP operates in a space that directly intersects with the traditional financial system, and that changes everything about how it behaves, how it grows, and how it gets adopted. Here's where the majority could be getting it wrong again. People often assume that success in crypto looks the same for every asset: rapid price appreciation, strong retail demand, and viral momentum. But what if XRP's success looks quiet? What if its biggest milestones don't create immediate price reactions, but instead build a foundation that only reflects invaluation over a longer period of time? That kind of growth is much harder to recognize and even harder to stay patient with. Now consider the idea of infrastructure. In traditional finance, infrastructure is everything: payment rails, settlement layers, liquidity providers. These are not things that get replaced overnight. They evolve slowly, often behind closed doors, through testing, partnerships, and regulatory alignment. If XRP is positioning itself as part of that infrastructure, then its journey is naturally going to be slower and more complex than what most retail investors expect. And this leads to another overlooked factor: visibility. Retail investors tend to rely on public announcements, news headlines, and social media signals, but institutions don't operate like that. A lot of their testing, integration, and strategic positioning happens quietly. That means by the time something becomes visible to the public, a significant portion of the groundwork may already be complete. So if you're only looking at what's being announced, you might actually be late to understanding what's already happening. Let's also talk about incentives because this is critical. The crypto market is filled with influencers, analysts, and content creators, all with different motivations. Some benefit from bullish narratives, others from controversy, and some from simply keeping attention high. This creates an environment where extreme viewpoints dominate. Balanced, realistic perspectives often get ignored because they don't generate the same level of engagement. So if your understanding of XRP is shaped by these extremes, there's a high chance you're not seeing the full picture. Another important angle is competition. While XRP has strong positioning in cross-border payments, it's not operating in isolation. Other technologies, both within crypto and in traditional finance, are also evolving. Central bank digital currencies, improved banking rails, and alternative blockchain solutions are all part of the same race. If the majority assumes XRP will dominate without resistance, that's a dangerous oversimplification. Real-world adoption is always competitive, and outcomes are rarely absolute. But here's where the perspective shifts again. Competition doesn't necessarily weaken XRP. It can validate the problem it's trying to solve. The more attention that cross-border efficiency gets, the more valuable solutions in that space become. The key question is not whether XRP is alone, but whether it can secure a meaningful share of that evolving ecosystem. And that answer depends on execution, partnerships, and timing, not just technology. Now step back and look at the bigger pattern. Every major financial shift in history has gone through phases of skepticism, experimentation, and gradual acceptance. Rarely does something move from concept to global dominance in a straight line. There are delays, setbacks, and periods where progress seems invisible. If you expect a smooth, predictable trajectory for XRP, you're likely setting yourself up for confusion. This brings us to a critical realization. The market doesn't reward the loudest narrative. It rewards the most accurate one over time. And accuracy often requires going against the crowd, questioning assumptions, and being comfortable with uncertainty. If everyone is convinced they already understand XRP's future, that confidence itself might be a warning sign. So instead of chasing certainty, the smarter approach might be to track signals. Look at adoption patterns, regulatory shifts, institutional behavior, and infrastructure development. These are slower signals, but they are far more reliable than short-term price movements or viral predictions. Now, this is where the conversation becomes even more uncomfortable, because we need to challenge not just the market, but the mindset of XRP holders themselves. If everyone could be wrong about XRP, then that also includes the most loyal supporters. And this is not about negativity, it's about clarity, because sometimes the biggest risk isn't being wrong about an asset, it's being overconfident about it. One of the most powerful forces in any market is belief. And in the XRP community, belief runs deep. People have held through uncertainty, through legal battles, through years of slow price action. That kind of conviction is rare, but it can also create blind spots. When you believe strongly in an outcome, you naturally filter information in a way that supports that belief. You start to ignore contradictions, downplay risks, and amplify anything that confirms your expectations. This is where a dangerous pattern can form. Instead of analyzing XRP objectively, many investors begin defending it emotionally. Every delay gets justified, every setback gets reframed as a hidden advantage, and every criticism gets dismissed as ignorance. But markets don't reward emotional attachment. They reward accurate assessment. And if your view becomes too one-sided, you lose the ability to adapt. Now let's flip the perspective. What if the biggest opportunity with XRP doesn't come from blind belief, but from strategic awareness? That means understanding both the strengths and the limitations at the same time. XRP has real utility, strong positioning, and a clear use case, but it also operates in a highly complex, regulated, and competitive environment. Ignoring either side of that equation creates a distorted view. Another major misconception that needs to be addressed is the idea of inevitability. You'll often hear statements like, XRP will replace global payment systems, or banks have no choice but to use XRP. But in reality, nothing in finance is inevitable. Even the best technologies can fail to reach full adoption due to external factors: politics, regulation, competing interests, or simply timing. Assuming a guaranteed outcome removes the need for critical thinking, and that's where mistakes begin. Let's also talk about patience, but not in the way it's usually discussed. Most people think patience simply means holding and waiting for price to go up, but real patience is more complex. It involves continuously reassessing your position, staying informed, and being willing to adjust your expectations as new information emerges. Holding without thinking is not a strategy. It's passivity. And in a fast-changing market like crypto, passivity can be risky. Now, here's something that very few people are willing to consider. What if XRP succeeds, but not in the way most people expect? What if it becomes a critical piece of financial infrastructure, widely used behind the scenes, but without delivering the kind of explosive price action that retail investors are waiting for? That scenario is not impossible. In fact, in traditional markets, many highly valuable systems operate without dramatic price movements because their role is functional, not speculative. This creates a disconnect between utility and expectation. Retail investors are often driven by the idea of life-changing gains, while institutions are focused on efficiency, cost reduction, and stability. If XRP aligns more with institutional needs, then its price behavior could reflect that, steady, controlled, and less volatile than people anticipate. And if that happens, those expecting massive, rapid gains could be caught off guard. Another layer to this is timing cycles. Crypto markets move in waves: hype, correction, consolidation, and expansion. XRP has already gone through multiple phases, and each phase has reshaped expectations. The danger comes when people assume that the next phase will simply repeat the past. Markets evolve, participants change, and conditions shift. What worked before may not work the same way again. So the real question becomes, are you prepared for a different outcome? Not a negative one, just a different one. Because if everyone is aligned around a single vision of the future, the actual outcome often diverges from that vision in unexpected ways. And those who are mentally flexible are the ones who adapt the fastest. At this stage, the smartest approach is not to be blindly bullish or blindly skeptical. It's to be observant. Watch how XRP behaves during key moments. Watch how institutions interact with it. Watch how regulations shape its path. These signals will tell you far more than any prediction ever could. One thing should be very clear: this conversation was never about proving XRP right or wrong. It was about challenging assumptions, breaking away from crowd thinking, and understanding that in markets like crypto, the biggest opportunities often come from seeing what others overlook. Because if everyone is aligned on one narrative, whether bullish or bearish, the real outcome tends to unfold somewhere completely different. XRP sits in a unique position in the crypto space. It's not purely driven by hype, and it's not completely disconnected from real-world use either. It exists at the intersection of speculation and utility, and that makes it harder to predict than most assets. The majority of people want simple answers. Will it go up? How high can it go? Yeah, when will it explode? But the reality is far more complex, and complexity doesn't spread easily on social media. That's why so many investors end up relying on oversimplified narratives that don't fully capture what's actually happening. Now think about everything we've discussed. Expectations may be too fast, timelines may be misunderstood, institutional behavior may not align with retail hopes, utility may not translate into immediate price action, and most importantly, the market itself may not reward the majority view, at least not in the way people expect. When you combine all of these factors, you start to see why the idea of everyone being wrong is not as extreme as it first sounds. But here's where the real value lies. If you can accept uncertainty instead of fighting it, you gain a different kind of advantage. Instead of chasing predictions, you start observing patterns. Instead of reacting to hype, you start analyzing structure. Instead of following the crowd, you begin forming your own perspective based on signals that most people ignore. And in a market driven by emotion and speculation, that shift alone can completely change your results. There's also a deeper psychological layer to all of this. Most investors are not just looking for profit. They're looking for validation. They want to be right. They want their belief in XRP to be confirmed by price going up quickly and dramatically. But markets don't operate to validate beliefs. They operate on liquidity, timing, and positioning. And sometimes the market will move in ways that feel completely disconnected from what seems logical. That doesn't mean XRP has failed. It means expectations may need to evolve. So moving forward, the question is not whether XRP will succeed in some absolute sense. The question is whether your understanding of XRP is flexible enough to adapt as new information comes in, because the people who succeed long-term are not the ones who predict perfectly. They're the ones who adjust quickly. They stay grounded, they stay aware, and they don't let narratives control their decisions. And this brings us back to the core idea of this entire discussion. What if everyone's wrong about XRP? Not because XRP lacks potential, but because the story being told around it is incomplete, too focused on extremes, too dependent on timelines, too disconnected from how complex systems actually evolve. If that's true, then the real opportunity is not in following that story. It's in questioning it. Take this as a shift in perspective rather than a conclusion. Keep watching, keep analyzing, and most importantly, keep thinking independently. Because in a market where attention is constantly pulled in different directions, clarity becomes your biggest asset. Or And before we close, a quick but important note. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Always do your own research, understand your risk tolerance, and consult with a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions. The crypto market is highly volatile and no outcome is guaranteed. If you found value in this perspective, make sure to stay connected with XRP on Moon, because sometimes the biggest insights are the ones that challenge what everyone else believes.